Hello student, I am Dr. Smita Patil and I teach in Department of Gender and Development Studies. Today I am going to discuss about this topic, Islamic family law. The main objectives, aims and objective of this lecture is to understand the historical development of the Islamic law, to know the school of thoughts through that, and the Islamic jurisprudence, how it developed, and then colonial debates, how it has been taken forward also. One is to understand what does it mean Islam. Islam means, the definition is a peace and submission. Submission to whom? That is then the question needs to be asked, and submission to the will of God in the secular manner, establishment of peace. Sharia as an integral part to Islamic guide to the ethics, and fiqh is the Islamic jurisprudential law. Fiqh is something that, and I quote, whole science of the jurisprudence. Fiqh is the knowledge, again I quote, knowledge and obligations derived from the four sources of the Islamic law, the Quran, Sunnah, Ijma and Qiyas. And this is, of course, I am deriving this whole argument from Hidayatullah, which has been cited by Flavia Agnes' work. It is analyzed that then Mohammedan or Mohammedan law also. So, to this day means the appropriate school of the law modified by customs were legally applicable. For Werner Mansky, according to him, and I quote, the internal diversity of Muslim law matches that of the pluralist Hindu conceptualization, as both legal system had to rely on human processes to evolve the laws. And Mansky in fact is doing a sort of comparison between the Hindu and the Islamic law. So one has to look at also the colonial period and the evolution of the Anglo-Hindus and Anglo-Mohammedan law, and then jurisprudential intervention grounded in the religious texts by the religion experts like Qurans and then Pandits, how they interpret it. So it is observed that, and I quote again, while a large part of the Muslim law is unmodified, there have been some specific stretches such as the dissolution of the Muslim Marriage Act of 1939 and the Muslim Women Protection of the Rights upon Divorce Act in 1986, and most recently that you would also see the Triple Talaq also bill was passed, and in 2019 we also see the modification in this act of Muslim Women Protection of the Rights and Divorce. And it is again observed that a large section of the Muslim community as outside the purview of the official law, and the disputes was revolved within the community, which is Jamaat, with the help of the community leaders as a part of the custom of a particular community. Now the sources of the Islamic law needs to be also understood. Quran are divine revelations. The word of the God is one of the highest sources of the law. Quran as a reading and recital, the will of the God communicated to the Prophet through Angel Gabriel. And then you would see the verses discuss about the family relation in the Quran. The Khalifas, Prophet's successor, executing the disputes based on the Quran, and you would also see the ancient Arab system of arbitration and customary law. So it is then you would see that further analyze that, but and I quote this again from Agnes' book. But the Quran cannot be constructed as a law; it is a source of law. Divine law cannot become a legal system in its own right. It requires human intervention by the way of interpretation or application, as Flavia Agnes argues, and I unquote it here. So another source of the Islamic law is the Sunnah or the tradition, and etymologically the word Sunnah means trodden path. And you would see initially the term was applied to the customs and practices of the pre-Islamic tribes and the early Muslims of the AD 17th century. Later, it connotated the practice and the procedure of the Prophet, and the hadith is binding principles of the Quran. Now, it's again very important to understand that by 8th century, it becomes the ideal and established doctrines of the ancient scholar expounded by its representative. Hence, in the present context, Sunnah could either mean the living tradition of the schools or the tradition of the Prophet. The third source of the Islamic law is the Ijma, an agreement among the legal scholar of any generation. So it was influenced, and the Hanif doctrine that argued that provisions of the law must change according to the time. Now, according to Maliki doctrine, the new factors require the new decisions. It is noted that in developing Islamic law by the consensus, the doctrines of the Ittijihad, which means using one's own reasoning to deduce the rule of the Sharia law, was developed. With the passage of the time, however, this liberty to reason was restricted, and by the 9th century, Ijtihad was considered as privilege of the great scholar of the past. So, last source in the Islamic law is Qiyas, and means reasoning by analogy. It does not produce new principle. It is a rule of the interpretation. It is noted that it becomes a source of law as a source of the compromise by the Shafi and Maliki schools, and there is also a concept of blending desirable rules from variety of the sources, which is known as the within Islamic jurisprudence. And I'm drawing this idea by and large from the work of Werner Mansky, Deret and Flavia Agnes. So according to Flavia Agnes, the fatwas, the legal opinions of the scholars and the judges, though not a source of the law, have been instrumental in the development and enrichment of the legal principles. And you would see that there are two schools of thoughts by and large, that is Shia and Sunni schools, and the two boards sects of the Islamic law. And you would see again in the Shia and Sunnis the four important school which comes under. A is a Hanifa, then B is Malkiya, then Shafi, and then Hanbali. And you would see that Abu Hanifi, who founded Hanifi school in AD 699-767, and also known as a Khalifa school, and which is started from Iraq, and especially it spread across the Syria, Afghanistan, Turkish, and Central Asia, and then eventually also the Indian continent. And then Imam Jafar, the founder of the Shia school, prompted schools. Among the Shia schools are the following schools. It is Itna Ashari, the next is Jafarliya, then Ismatiya, and then Ismatiya sects of the Shia school was popular in Persia, Bohras and Khoja sects, and part of the Ismail sects. And you would see that even these two sects, you can see that they're practicing their own doctrine and philosophy. So the doctrine of the Imamat, it includes the marks the importance difference between the Shias and the Sunnis, and the Khalifa, the successor of the Prophet, is the leader according to Sunni Shia as follows. And then abolition of then further the Caliphate happened in 1924. Then you would see Imam, for instance, in Shias as a final interpreter of the law. And then you would see that how it has been observed. Some Shia sects like the Dawoodi Bohras originated as outcomers of the rebellion against the oppressive Shia theology in around 8th century AD and were considered to be reformative and emancipatory. So then it is further observed that the laws of the two main sects and their subjects vary a great deal from each other. Among the various schools, the Malki schools is the most favorable to the woman, and the Safia school comes next to that, because when one is looking at the gender relations, that, and then you would see North Africa mainly follows the Malki law, and the woman enjoy greater rights and the freedom in that. And then under this doctrine, a wife has option to dissolve her marriage on the following grounds: on the cruelty, non-payment of the maintenance, absence of the husband, and there are a number of provisions which are given that. Now in the Sharia law with the tribal, within tribal Arab, because when one is looking at this debate, one has to also understand the composition of the population and the geographical location. And you would see that it was a contract was applied to the marriage. So the Arab trader possessed the knowledge related to the law contract, and the principle of the contract related to the social relationship and marriage. Shariat is based on the patriarchal family structure, and you would see that it is not linked to the feudal structure. It is also then noted that was also the first legal system to grant women right to inheritance and stipulated fixed share to the woman, and which is one has to remember and learn this. So in the contrast to the Hinduism and the Christianity, further if you look at these debates, marriage is a civil and dissoluble contract. In Islamic marriage, change from the system to the contract when European change from feudalism to capitalism, and it becomes a part of the English law in the 19th century. It becomes codified and incorporated to the Hindu law in the year 1955, as Agnes says, and it is analyzed that the movement of the progressive society has been a movement from the status to contract. So the rights of the meher again is given in the Islamic law, which is central to the Muslim marriage, and it is considered as a safeguard to the woman. It is analyzed that the higher amount of the meher stipulated in the Nikahnama, contract of the marriage, and Kabinnama, agreement of the marriage, was meant to act as a deterrent to unilateral divorce. And you would see that further the right to enter into pre-marriage, these again agreements mainly relate two aspects: is the regulation of the matrimonial life and stipulation regarding the dissolution of the marriage. This can be effective way controlling polygamy, and the right to maintenance for the personal allowances as known as a means, and 1/3 rule regarding the testamentary succession is given to the women. So it is noted that the woman's share under the Islamic law of inheritance not equal to the of her male counterparts. It is further analyzed that the stipulation falls short of the present concept of the gender equality, because one has to also see the context the law emerged, and then and also relate this debate in the contemporary context to understand. So it was radical measure from its time, but was based on the principle of equality. But today one has to go further, and although there are wide differences in the laws of the various sects and subsects, the inheritance of the rights of the woman under the Islamic law can be broadly categorized as follows. The daughters inherit half the share inherited by the son. The mother inherits 1/6 of the property, while the where the gathers inheritance one third. The wife, or if there is more than one wife, then all of them jointly inheritance 1/8 of the husband's property. So it is then observed that Islamic State is stated in the theocratic. Several countries are having this, and Islam as well as others have modified the law to meet the demands of the changing social conditions and the values. And the codification of the traditional law is a part of the enactment of the statutory principle. It leads to further transformation in the Islamic laws, and the ulemas are approved or modified as per the suggestion. And you would see that whole debate which is there in the women's movement, personal laws versus the uniform civil code debate, which is ongoing again a debate. So one has to understand further that to uncodified Muslim law has an incorporeal local customs, and it completes the rejection of the Islamic family law with the secular system happened to the countries such as Lebanon or Israel. Now the Turkish family and Turkish family. Family code is a part of the countries like the Lebanons, and as I mentioned to you, the other countries. It is also noted that around 20th century have enacted either the substantive or regulatory reforms to change the matrimonial law, either partly or wholly, by relying upon the principles of ijtihad within the broad framework of the Islam itself. And you would see also the Hanific school as one of the popular school in some of the countries in the Asia, and it is argued that the dissolution of the Muslim Marriage Act of 1939 incorporated principle of the Maliki law and granted the woman right to divorce. According to Hanafi authorities, the rule of the other Sunni schools may be applied by the command of the sovereign power. And therefore, it's been very important to understand this, that though this principle which is there in 1931, the ruler of the Bhopal, and I'm citing again the example, enacted a code, Debita Tahafai, who brought out this few changes, the law of the protection of right to the spouse, incorporated the Malki rules. And the same principle was later relied upon while granting Muslim women in the British India the right to divorce through the enactment of the dissolution of the Muslim Marriage Act. One is to understand here that while analyzing the changes of the Indo-Islamic law, there are interpretation and the departures between the law and the local custom. Because it's always been, the study shows, if you look at the ethnographical work, sociological work, that there's always been, the local customs which are always been accommodated time and again. So it is analyzed that Mopelas of the Kerala or Lakshadweep did not follow the Sharia, and instead they adopted maternal tradition prevalence in this region. And the Shariat came into India in the 12th or the 30th century. The Hanifas who invaded India further, Flavia Agnes says that dependent on the religious and legal attributions called ulemas. So the ulemas played a significant role in this. And the Sultanates followed the basic law of the Islam, the Sharias, as interpreted by the ulemas in the royal codes. And therefore, this channel, that is the Shariat, was established in India, and the textbooks of the Hanafi law are based on the Fatwa-e-Ilmgiri, which is a collection of the fatwas, and the hadith which is given, as hadith means the guide, the ways in which it provides directions. So the question is that how do we look at these debates further? While there are various schools of the Islamic theology, the courts have been an important source of advancing the Islamic jurisprudence after the East India Company acquired the dividend rights under the Mughal emperor in the parts of the Bengal, Bihar and Orissa. I mean, it's East India. So they accepted to settle the dispute between the natives in order to find genuine and authentic law of the natives, and several scriptures were translated into English and were replied upon while adjecting over matters which was categorized in the personal law of the native communities. In the 1791, under direction from Warren Hastings, Charles Hamilton translated the Arabic text, the Hadith, into English. Sir William Jones translated Al-Sirajiyat, the Mohammedan law of the inheritance, and the Nil Bigla Digest of the Mohammedan law was based on Fatwa-e-Alamgiri, and then you would see in the colonial code relied on these translation texts is the evolution of Anglo-Mohammedan law. This is how the process evolved in the colonial period. In the post-independence India, the Indo-Muslim law and the Indo-Islamic law, which you would see that came into a debate, and it is observed that though much of the Islamic law has remained unmodified, the official law has been advanced through judicial interpretation by the Supreme Court and various high courts on the case by case. The Muslim has also evolved through the legal opinion of the ulemas and the qazis in binding the judgment, and you would see that the number of judgment in which that how the it evolved. And therefore it's very important to understand and analyze also that it is an interesting to note that the time of the independence, women rights under the Muslim wars was superior to the Brahminical Hindu law and the Christian matrimonial law. I mean, one has to also draw this comparison and to understand. So according to Flavia Agnes, and I quote, although Muslim law contains several positive provisions which would be safeguard women's rights, these provisions have deteriorated due to socio-cultural reasons and patriarchal subversion, and I unquote it. And then you will see the practices like the seclusion, which we call it parda, and the child marriage have rendered women vulnerable and dependent on their male relative. The Quranic right of the meher has been reduced to the mere tokenism, and exorbitant demands of the dowry have become norm among the various Muslim communities. Poverty and illiteracy have contributed to the subordination of the woman. Thus, you would see that the Muslims' notion of the marriage or the marital union is contracted in the nature in spite of having solemnized by reciting the verses from Quran. It is considered as a civil contract meant to legitimize sexual relation for the procreation, and then further noted that since marriage is a contractual in nature, it is imperative that both parties agreed to get married of their own will. So one has to in fact understand that there are several issues which one can look forward in order to understand this. One has to go further and try to understand that for Muslim notion of the marriage, as I already mentioned that it's a contractual in nature, and one has to further say that the free consent is there, and then to be understood in order to understand the minor major debates also, and it is based on the contractual agreement of the marriage, which can be turned anytime by the female also. And the unique feature of this contract marriage under the Islam is that it conditions cannot be stipulated within this contract. This can be term and then the nikah, the condition of the marriage, right to stipulate condition in the marriage contract is a Quranic right bestowed upon the woman. So there are debates on the prenuptial agreements and not party of the any matrimonial status, and then it can be delegated right to divorce. Meher is a Quranic right and also known as a dower in the diverse legal texts, and the specific mention of this rights is made and subsequent legal texts, and it is further noted that the stipulation of meher at the time of marriage is an integral part of the Muslim marriage. It can be stipulated as either prompt and or deferred also. Islamic laws of inheritance are different from the Hindu law of succession, and there is no distinction between the ancestral and the self-acquired property or movable or immovable property. It is noted that Islamic laws of inheritance are complex in nature and also impacted unequal gendered relationship of the property. So I would conclude by saying through this lecture how these two streams, Shia and Sunnis within Islam actually taken a shape of the law, and then how those school of thought eventually evolved under the development of the Islamic law across the world, and particularly where these laws comes from. At the same time that in the local tradition that as people move on and shift and migrate from one place to other, there's also been an impact on the custom and the everyday custom and the law which combines here. But I would also say that at the same time have a look at some of the interesting book written on Islamic law by Flavie Agnes. Thank you.